All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Cheryl Sullivan, and I'm a research assistant professor and entomologist at UVM within the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, Department of Agriculture, Landscape, and Environment. Whew, it's a mouthful. So, this talk tonight is going to cover some tick ID, tick-borne diseases, and some tips on how to protect yourself and your animals and manage your property to reduce your risk for tick bites. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll leave here tonight with more information that you ever wanted to know about ticks. And I do ask that if you have any questions to please hold them until the end or type them into the chat as we go along. And hopefully we will have some time to get to them later on. I also want to say that this presentation is being recorded, and I'll send a link of this PowerPoint presentation to you as a PDF, but I'll also send the link of the video later this week for you to have as well. All right, so real quick about what I do here at UVM. I'm part of a research group that strives to develop practical solutions to real-world pest problems. And we specialize in the integrated pest management of pests, and that combines multiple strategies that focus on preventing pest issues through the use of surveillance and monitoring and use of biological controls as chemical pesticide alternatives. So half of my research and outreach efforts are focused on specialty crop management, primarily greenhouse, ornamental, and high tunnel vegetables on working farms. And the other half actually focuses on tick ecology and their management. So a lot of our work is federally funded from various foundations and endowments, but we also have many private donors that also contribute to our research endeavors. So anyone who works and recreates outside is at risk for tick bites and contracting a tick-borne illness. Pets and livestock are also at risk for disease. We recently conducted a survey and sent that out to Vermont farmers because we really wanted to learn what they do to protect themselves and their animals. And here are some preliminary results highlights from that. When we asked participants to select a black-legged tick among images of a dog tick, a bed bug, and a black-legged tick, 48% entered it correctly, and 15% were unsure what a black-legged tick was. And when asked what seasons black-legged ticks were most active in the Northeast, although ticks can be active year-round when temps are above freezing and no snow, peak activity is actually both spring and fall, and only 25% selected that option. 28% answered correctly that both adult and nymph stages of black-legged ticks can transmit Lyme disease. And 70% agreed that ticks and tick-borne diseases are increasing on their property. And 69% thought that ticks were an occupational hazard. So when we asked about how ticks and tick-borne diseases have impacted them in their operations, the top responses were that money was spent on personal protection against diseases and to treat themselves, family, or pets for a suspected disease. And there was avoidance of working on their farm in areas where they knew ticks were most active, and avoidance of recreating on their property in their spare time because of ticks. So clearly ticks are impacting our daily lives. And we're almost done with a final survey summary, and we're going to actually write this up and have a publication about it and post a fact sheet on our website. So mosquitoes and ticks are the primary arthropod disease vectors in the world. So while mosquitoes tend to kill more people than any other animal by the viruses that they transmit, ticks will actually transmit a greater diversity of disease-causing organisms. Here in the US, ticks are responsible for transmitting almost 95% of tick-borne diseases. Ticks are parasitic mites. They're not insects, they're arachnids like spiders, and they're classified as being either hard or soft ticks. So these hard ticks have a hard shield on their top side called a scutum, whereas soft ticks lack that feature and they have a real leathery sort of appearance. And this shield is really important because when you ID hard ticks, it's a primary feature that you use to tell them apart. There's over 900 tick species in the world. And here in the US, there's about 90 species. And here in Vermont specifically, there's 15 species and 15 of those have potential to transmit diseases to humans. So ticks tend to create significant economic losses from the medical and veterinary disease diagnostics and treatments for humans, pests, and livestock. But in actuality, this is only from a real small percentage of ticks because most ticks are really only associated with their primary wildlife hosts and where those hosts live in their specific habitats. And people always ask what ticks are good for and if they have some positive value. They do. They do act as a food source for small mammals and other arthropods. And they also play an important role in wildlife population regulation and natural selection. And they contribute to the overall biodiversity of our planet. And they can also be indicators of ecosystem health because in general, there tends to be less disease when you have more diverse communities. So tick-borne diseases have been on the rise nationwide, especially here in the Northeast. There's several different diseases, and I'll talk more about them later. And the risk for those tend to be geographically focused, where the pathogens are endemic. And that tends to correspond with the range of the tick species that transmit them. So over 95% of the reported cases of tick-borne diseases in the US, Lyme disease accounts for about 75% of that. And that occurs here in the Northeast primarily and in the upper Midwest. So this increase in tick-borne diseases is best illustrated by Lyme disease, where over the past 20 years, cases have been surging and they have almost doubled since the early 90s. And that's what that chart on this slide reflects. And you can also see that represented in the map, how the dark blue is the new expansion of Lyme disease across much of the Northeast compared to, 20, almost 20 years ago at this point. So tick bites can result in several different illnesses. So they harbor a lot of pathogens like bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and they can also cause a whole slew of mysterious rashes and disorders. So the State of Vermont Agency of Ag Public Health Division only conducts annual surveillance for the top 5 from the ticks that they collect across Vermont. And 99% of the tick-borne diseases here in Vermont are caused by one tick species, the black-legged tick. And overall, nationwide, the top 3 tick-borne diseases are Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and anaplasmosis. However, here in Vermont, Lyme disease is number 1, followed by anaplasmosis, and they're both bacterial infections. The third is babesiosis, and that is a parasitic infection. Borrelia miyamotoi is a fairly recent issue. It's different from the Borrelia bacteria that causes Lyme. This one causes relapsing fever, and it does not typically have a rash associated with it. Powassan or deer tick virus is considered to be not considered to be established here, but that can be deadly. It is a virus and has killed people in New York, Maine, and elsewhere, and it's on the rise. So there is also a lot of other threats that are less common or emerging issues, like Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That tends to be more common out west, and you can get that from dog ticks. And then there's alpha-gal, and that's the red meat allergy that you get from Lone Star tick bites. But a lot of those don't really show up here, especially they really show up when people have traveled to places where those ticks are more prevalent. So the symptoms for a lot of these diseases are very similar, and they tend to manifest as being flu-like and may take up to about 30 days to appear. And for some of them, they might not even show up at all. So for Lyme disease, it's a bullseye rash that's a key sign of the disease, but that does not always occur. It only shows up in about 70% of the cases. And it also can have a delayed onset and not always look like a bullseye. So Lyme disease is often called the great imitator because these symptoms tend to mimic many other diseases. Because of this, it's often misdiagnosed, and it happens like what happens is it gets misdiagnosed and then it delays the correct treatment as the infection progresses. So a lot of these, or most of these actually, can be treated with antibiotics if they are detected early, because of tick-borne diseases are preventable and most are treated if we catch them in time. But the good news is not all ticks carry disease-causing pathogens, whereas about a little over half of them tend to come up positive. So this just represents a basic timeline of the detection of some tick-borne diseases in the US compared to Vermont. So Lyme disease was reported about 50 years ago in Lyme, Connecticut, then about 10 years later in 1988 here in Vermont. In contrast, it took about 40 years for babesiosis to show up. The Borrelia miyamotoi, that new Borrelia species that causes the relapsing fever, was only first reported in humans in 2011, and it showed up here in the US shortly after and has been looming here ever since. And now there's hundreds of cases a year of some of these diseases, especially now that surveillance and reporting efforts has become a national priority. So why is there such an increase in tick-borne diseases? There are several reasons. Climate change is one of them. I'll talk more about that, I think, on the next slide. But land use changes have a really strong influence as well. So over 100 years ago, approximately 75% of Vermont's landscape and elsewhere was cleared for pasture and timber. And the reforestation and subsequent fragmentation since then has created this fantastic tick habitat because it creates excellent microclimates that they like, but it also creates edge habitats and habitats where a lot of their key hosts like rodents and deer thrive as well. So until recently, there was a lack of tick research and control measures because much of the emphasis has always been on mosquitoes and mosquito-borne illness prevention. And since funding has become more available for surveillance, control, and outreach endeavors for ticks, it's led to the discovery of a lot of new pathogens, it's increased reporting, and we're getting a better understanding of the distribution of the ticks and their pathogens. So climate change has a lot of effects on ticks. The higher temperatures and increased precipitation as a result provide conditions that promote tick survival. Ticks really thrive in humid environments. They really like the moisture. The worst thing for ticks is really hot and dry weather, especially during their part of their life cycle when they hatch from egg to larva. So if it's droughty right now, that's kind of good because it hopefully will take out some of the larval tick population because they don't like it hot and dry. It's the worst thing for them. So as these increasing temperatures have been occurring, this has also allowed ticks to expand their range into new areas and also to higher elevations. And these are areas that were previously inhospitable to them because of the climate. It also increases their reproduction because it accelerates their life cycle. And most importantly, warmer climates prolong tick activity periods, which increases your risk for tick bites and disease transmission because you have more of an opportunity to come and contact them throughout the year because they're active year round. The temperatures are above freezing, and especially if there is no snow, which is concerning. So it's really important that you get to know your ticks. There are a lot of species out there, and each one of them can transmit their own kinds of pathogens. And I'll talk a little bit more of each of these in detail. But this is what some of the important ones here in Vermont look like. Now, in other places like down south or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts or Connecticut, they have a whole other complex of tick species to worry about. But these are the ones that we're most concerned about here in Vermont. The black-legged tick and the American dog tick are the most common. Lone Star ticks and the invasive longhorn tick are emerging threats, and they're considered not to be established here in Vermont. But the Lone Star tick does tend to show up once in a while. Both of these ticks are found in abundance in New York and Mass and South. So it's just kind of a question of when they might show up. Life cycle wise, it's important to know that ticks have 4 life stages. They have the egg stage, an immature larva and nymph stage, and then there's the adult. So like other arachnids, ticks have 8 legs as adults and nymphs, but their teeny tiny larvae only have 6. So for ticks to mature to the next life stage, they have to find and feed on a host. And if they don't find one, they eventually die. So some species use 3 different hosts throughout their lifetime. Others use only one. The more hosts that they use, the greater the chances of them picking up a disease-causing pathogen at some point throughout their life, their blood meal. So the black-legged tick is the one that we are most concerned about. It's a 3-host tick. It lives mostly in deciduous forests and along forest edges, especially where it's brushy. Adults will quest or look for a host around knee height on tips of vegetation, whereas the adult stages, like the nymphs and larvae, tend to quest closer to the ground on leaf litter and debris. The black-legged tick females are easily distinguished from other tick species by that orange-red body that's surrounding the black scutum, the shield there. Males are dark brown to black, and their shield covers most of their back. Males don't really feed a lot, and although they can be infected like the female, they're not typically involved in transmitting infections. It's that poppy seed size nymph stage and that larger adult female stage that are primarily responsible for transmitting diseases. So a lot of people that acquire tick-borne diseases don't even recall being bitten because nymphs are so small that they go unnoticed. And oftentimes you can't feel the ticks attached to you because they inject a numbing agent as they work their way in. So the larval stages tend to pose less of a threat because most, but not all, of the disease-causing pathogens are acquired at their first feeding, and that's usually from a small rodent that tend to harbor most of their pathogens. Tick life cycles are very complicated, just like this diagram that I have up here. And that's one of the main reasons why they tend to be so difficult to manage. So the black-legged ticks, again, 3-host, 2-year life cycle. And that dictates when they acquire their pathogens. So this means they have to feed on 3 different hosts to complete their life cycle over that course of 2 years. So in the first year of the tick's life, they start out as eggs that are laid by adult females in spring in large masses, like masses of thousands. This is after they have fed on their host, which for adults is commonly a white-tailed deer. And then what happens is the larvae hatch in late summer, and then they disperse to find their host, typically small rodents, where they acquire most of their pathogens that they carry with them for the rest of their life. So after the larvae feed, they then drop off the host, they turn into nymphs, and they go off and find a host again. Then they feed, the nymphs will feed, then they fall off, and they emerge the following spring or active throughout the summer. And then they feed again, fall off, turn into adults, and emerge in fall, and so on and so forth. So the distribution of these ticks tends to rely a lot on the distribution of their primary reproductive host. And for black-legged ticks, that's the white-tailed deer. However, the deer aren't the ones that are harboring the pathogens. It's the white-footed deer mice, where 50 to 90% are infected with disease-causing bacteria, particularly Borrelia here in the Northeast. So these black-legged ticks pick them up. I mean, I said that already as their first feeding as larvae. But if they don't get them as larvae, they have other opportunities to pick them up as nymphs or adults. So why does the life cycle matter? It's because the medical treatment for tick-borne diseases typically coincides with the peak activity times of adults and nymphs, which by old standards is typically October and May for adults, and May to July for nymphs. However, as you can see from this figure from Vermont Department of Health, you can see that emergency room and care for tick-borne illnesses is now a year-round sort of thing. Okay, moving on. The second most commonly encountered tick in Vermont is the American dog tick. The females have a red-brown body, and they have this really cool-looking ornate or modeled scutum or shield, right? So these tend to attack small, or they tend to attack medium-sized hosts, especially dogs, but sometimes they get on humans, especially as adults. Larvae and nymphs really tend to mainly infest small mammals. You tend to find this tick primarily along forest edges and in areas with little or no tree cover, like grassy pastures and fields and scrubland, especially along trails. They tend to be, a little more open environment than a black-legged tick likes to hang out in. And this tick is responsible for transmitting Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia to humans, both of which are rare occurrences in Vermont, but it's more so out west, the Midwest, west is where a lot of that tends to be more of a problem with the dog tick. The next tick is one that doesn't really affect humans, but it affects our moose. And, most of you are here from Vermont. I think there's some from Maine, maybe New Hampshire too, but we all love our moose. And I think a lot of us might be familiar with the winter tick. It's my own personal favorite tick. It infests large ungulates, not only moose, but also affects cattle and horses. They're a one-host tick, and they usually use a single moose, or host, I should say, which is typically a moose here in these parts during their life. The winter ticks used to cause only sporadic die-offs in the early 1900s, but now, because of climate change, their die-offs are almost near annual events. So research has shown that up to 91% of moose calves can succumb to these tick infestations. The mortality is caused by severe tick infestation, averaging around 50,000 ticks per animal, which is a lot. And I spared the pictures of the poor dead moose calves because it's just so sad. And their feeding causes weight and hair loss. And these female ticks get so engorged after feeding that they look like the size of a grape. Crazy. And they can have something like 1 to 3 millimeters of blood inside. And that's a lot. That's a lot of blood loss if you multiply that by 50 to 100,000. So because of the climate changing, these ticks now have a survival advantage during their off-host period. So this is especially evident in spring because that's when the big engorged females fall off the moose to lay eggs. And they used to fall on snow, but now that it melts so quickly or is absent now, they have a lot more of an opportunity to survive. So in fall, that delayed snowfall prolongs the questing period of the larva because it's fall when they're recruited to the moose. And the snow used to cover them up and knock them off vegetation. But now without it, moose tend to have more of a chance of coming across them in the field. Oh, and here's an example of what a moose hide can look like with some of these infestations of thousands of winter ticks. The picture on the left is a bunch of adults that are not engorged, and the ones on the right looks a little blurry actually from my end. You can see that they're a bunch of fed, big fat fed females. So this tick's larvae tend to quest in large clusters on the tips of vegetation, waiting for a host to brush up against them. You can find these in autumn. And these are just some pictures that I took here in Vermont that I've encountered over the years, going to look for winter ticks up where our moose live. And you really only encounter these if you're hanging out in the woods where there's a lot of moose. But sometimes they can get on cattle and horses. And I believe a caribou died or had some infestations or might have died in New Hampshire from a severe infestation. They can also infect elk and captive deer. especially in captivity. I know some mortalities have occurred in Pennsylvania and elsewhere from them. And this is what it looks like when you happen to stumble across a winter tick bomb. And that's my leg right there. And I had something like 15,000 ticks on me in this picture. I know because my students and I counted them all. And that sampling flag had over 20,000 ticks on it. It took a really long time to count, but we're just dying to know how many ticks were on there. So this is why it's really good to carry a lint roller with you, which I'm going to talk more about later. So if you like red meat, you do not want to meet up with this Lone Star tick. This tick is not yet known to be established here in Vermont, but it does show up from time to time. And this picture here is actually from a Lone Star tick that was submitted to us here this past summer that was found in Chittenden County. So the adult females have a distinct white dot in the middle of their back, and they tend to be found mostly in woodlands with dense undergrowth and around animal resting areas. And they have a lot of hosts, a lot of different hosts, and they parasitize them in very high numbers. And their larvae will tend to quest in high numbers, just like the winter ticks that I showed. And they tend to be really aggressive biters. So unlike the other two ticks I talked about, those ticks tend to sit and wait for a host to pass by. Lone Star ticks will actually hunt their host down from several meters away, which is kind of creepy. You're just trying to sit there and enjoy your picnic, and you just have this tick just hunting you down. Makes you not want to sit on the ground. These ticks will cause diseases that are not common here in Vermont, but their most well-known one is the red meat allergy or alpha-gal syndrome. And what happens there is that bite transfers a sugar molecule into the body. And in some people, this triggers an allergic reaction to red meat and sometimes to dairy products. And the last tick I'm going to cover in detail is the Asian longhorn tick. Now, this tick is an invasive species from Asia, like the name says, and continues to establish populations across the US since it was first discovered in 2017. It has not yet been found in Vermont, to my knowledge. It attacks a wide range of domestic animals and wildlife, but it can also bite humans. It primarily impacts livestock health, but it may also spread pathogens that affect humans where they're from, but it's uncertain what and if they can transmit these diseases here in their range. I know it was recently found or announced earlier this year that they were found harboring bacteria that causes ehrlichiosis. You can find these ticks primarily in pastures in meadows, but they can also be found in the forest too. And the biggest issue with these is that they reproduce asexually, meaning that they don't need males to produce offspring. And this is really scary because this means it can only take one tick to create a new population in a new area. So that means if they get on a bird and that bird migrates, it's just going to bring them to all these new different places, which is really scary. And these ticks are kind of a boring reddish brown color, don't really have any fun patterns or, color tones to them. So this map shows our current status. And because longhorn ticks are primarily a pest on livestock, the movement of cattle is kind of considered a primary means of their spread and possibly how they ended up here. And usually when these are found, they tend to show up in extremely high numbers on animals and on the landscape because of their ability to clone themselves and reproduce asexually. So I talked a lot about the human side of things, but it's important to know that different ticks carry different pathogens that affect some animals and not others. So the black-legged ticks not only transmit the majority of diseases to humans, but they also do to some livestock, and companion animals. Dog, cats, and horses can also get Lyme disease and anaplasmosis. Cattle are prone to anaplasmosis, but that's more from dermacenter species ticks like American dog ticks or winter ticks. American dog ticks are that have that Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and dogs and Lone Star ticks are primarily it causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever in dogs. Lone Star ticks are a primary vector of bobcat fever to cat. That's a protozoan parasite, but also ehrlichiosis in dogs. I'm not going to talk a lot about companion animals, but the Companion Animal Parasite Council and Merck Veterinary Manual have a plethora of information about tick-borne diseases in cats and dogs and other animals that's worth checking out. I do want to talk a little bit about ticks and livestock, though. Cattle can acquire anaplasmosis, but it's a different type of anaplasmosis as found in humans and dogs. It's transmitted by the dermacenter species, primarily the American dog ticks and winter ticks. And this disease is typically found mostly in southern, Midwestern, and Western states. It causes anemia, and infected animals tend to end up being lifelong carriers. And it's really hard to diagnose because a lot of the signs kind of manifest as lethargy being the initial one. But it is treatable with antimicrobials. And I think a vaccine was in the works and is being developed, but I don't believe it's on the market. Don't quote me on that. So horses can acquire Lyme disease and anaplasmosis from black-legged ticks. And signs in horses include lameness, fever, joint pain, stiffness, weight loss, a lot of behavioral changes or neurologic issues, and more. And both of these can also be treated with antibiotics, but a lot of times it could be a little difficult to treat because it's hard. Sometimes it's hard for the bacteria to show up on the test. Sometimes it takes a while. And sometimes it can stick with them for a really long time. So you don't, even if they test positive, it's hard to tell if the treatment's actually working. And there is a vaccine that's sometimes given to horses, but it's not specifically for horses. It's a dog vaccine, so it's not used that way. So it is treated with antibiotics, which is a take-home message there. And in other regions of the world, there's this other disease called equine pyroplasmosis. It's also a bloodborne disease caused by protozoan parasites. It is a foreign disease, although there have been some isolated issues here in the US, not caused by ticks. And when horses get this, they remain infected throughout their entire life. And if they get this, the mortality rate can reach up to 50%. So hopefully, that's not something that's going to, persist or show up here in the US in any large number. So what do we do about this tick problem? Ticks seem to thrive just about anywhere and everywhere, from forests and grassy fields to urban parks and backyards. Tick management is very complicated on the landscape. Ticks are very, very long-lived, and they spend about 90% of their time off host, free living in the environment. And they're very ecologically complex. So because ticks are closely associated with their hosts, they're closely linked with their habitats that can change based on host density, the time of year, the availability of food. And this causes a real patchy distribution on this landscape, making finding them to target them for control very difficult. In addition, their life cycles are also influenced by the environmental conditions, especially as they relate to humidity. So most targeted management has been on small areas like residential backyards or pastures, but less so on the larger scale. And it's tough because a lot of times people will pick up and animals will pick up ticks in places other than their own properties because of this, because they tend to be so widely distributed. So because of this, it tends to take years of research to demonstrate that there are acceptable tick reductions from landscape treatments and to show that there's actually a reduction of tick encounters or reduced incidences of diseases resulting from the treatments. So it's challenging. So because of this, you have to look at tick management in an integrated or holistic sort of way. And the burden of tick management does fall on individual property owners and whether or not they choose to take precautionary measures or change their behaviors to avoid tick bites. So within integrated tick management, there are some key components that include monitoring for ticks through daily checks of yourself and your animals, personal protection measures, host management strategies, and environmental treatments. Now I'm going to cover these in a little more detail in a second. Okay, tick checks. These should be done every day, especially in spring and fall. Ticks really love tight spaces. So you really want to check all those places on your body, behind your ears, the groin, underarms, behind knees, scalp, and elsewhere. Pant lines, wherever clothes tend to be tight for the day. Using mirrors can help you get at those hard to see areas. If you have employees, having tick check posters and removal kits in common areas can help remind people to be diligent about doing that. Checking pets and livestock are also important. On animals, they tend to be found in some common places, that being around the eyes and the ears, under the chin, between the front and hind leg, and tail areas. So if you find a tick, you want to use fine tip tweezers to remove it by grabbing it by the head close to the skin and pulling upward with a steady, even pressure. You do not want to squeeze it or crush it between your fingers because that can increase the chances of that tick injecting pathogens into you. And then you want to clean that area with soap and water or alcohol. And you can either watch out for flu-like symptoms or consult a physician. And with the tick, you want to identify it if you can, just because your risk of getting things from black-legged ticks are much greater than if you had something like a dog tick attached to you. And you can either do that yourself, or if you're confident, or you can send it to a state agency or university for ID. They can also be sent in for pathogen testing. There's a few companies and some universities that have pathogen testing of ticks for the public. We do not have one offered here in Vermont. The closest one that accepts ticks from a large, geographic area is in Massachusetts. For quick results, there's also another lab in New Hampshire. And Maine and New Hampshire both offer services, I believe. I know Maine does. And the thing about testing ticks is it's not recommended at all to use tick testing as a means to determine whether or not to seek treatment after a tick bite, because the results tend to be misleading. So just because the tick tests positive, it does not necessarily mean that it transmitted the pathogen to you. So ticks, depending on the pathogen, have different attachment times, anywhere from a few hours up, or a few minutes really, up to a couple days. It's kind of a moving target, what that timeline is. Something like Powassan virus can be transmitted in as little as 15 minutes. It takes several hours for Lyme disease, up to a day or more. But the take home message here is if you find a tick on you, you want to remove it as soon as possible. And there are some websites out there that can actually show you the engorgement status of black-legged ticks at different life stages. So you get an idea of how long that tick might have been attached to you for. Okay, so we want to prevent tick bites in the first place. So personal protection is your first line of defense. Strategies include wearing light colored clothing, tucking pants into socks, wearing permethrin treated clothing, applying EPA approved repellents. And when using these repellents, it's really important to read the label because you want to be sure that it's labeled for use against ticks because a lot of stuff out there isn't. Putting clothes in a dryer is a good way to kill the ticks because the heat will dry them out because remember, they don't like it hot and dry. Washing them alone does not kill them. They survive washings just fine. It's best to leave clothes outside if you can before bringing them inside, especially if you've been working in tick habitats. Or you can bust out a lint remover and roll your clothing after you've been outside. I know that's a good strategy. Like if you go on hikes, if you carry a roller with you before you get in your car, it's good to like roll yourself off. That can help get a lot of those smaller ones that you otherwise might not be able to see. And it's also important that you educate others. So you want to make sure you don't forget to talk to your family members and employees about the dangers of ticks and how to protect against them. And here's an example of how a lint roller can help us remove some unwanted ticks from clothing. These are some black-legged ticks that I removed from my pants when I decided to sit on the ground one day doing field work. And it does work. Anyone else have pets that hang out on your furniture? I do. That's my dog. She loves to sleep in bed with me under the covers. Once they start, it's hard to break that habit. And sometimes she brings these little uninvited friends along with her. And, you know, remember, a lot of people don't remember having a tick on them or seeing a tick. And if you have pets, especially, you're kind of unaware that the tick's in your house and it can bite you in during the night. And of course, you're not going to feel it. If it's on your scalp and you're just unaware, you might just think it's a zit or something. So they have no problem crawling off your pets onto you. So you definitely want to make sure that you check your pets and treat them and check where they sleep, you know, kennels and everything else. And maybe reconsider letting them hang out with you on the furniture during those peak tick activity times. So ticks are recognized as being an occupational hazard, especially for those that work outside like foresters and farmers. Migrant workers are especially vulnerable if they're unaware of the dangers ticks pose. So in general, tick bites in the work environment are considered work-related injuries and are reportable. And it's really good to help develop a tick protection plan to help reduce tick bites. And we have some plans on our website that you can download. And some of the general recommendations are to train the workers about the tick-borne diseases and how to avoid being bitten. And this is especially important to provide resources to them in their preferred language and having supplies on hand like insect repellent, tweezers, and first aid kits that help for tick detection. And tick removal kits should be provided in employee common areas like bathrooms or housing units if you provide housing. We currently have a project where we're distributing a lot of these tick removal kits to farms across Vermont that has posters and mirrors and tweezers. So if anybody's interested in getting one of those, feel free to send me an email and I will send that right out to you. We've also been doing some surveillance for ticks on farms, looking at different areas and where ticks tend to be in the greatest number on a variety of different farms and a variety of different commodities. So there's a lot of places you can obtain information about ticks in other languages. This slide pretty much sums that up. The CDC and the Vermont Department of Health are two primary sites where free materials can be downloaded or ordered. And we also have Spanish. We also have a poster that we created in Spanish that you can download. And we also have some hard copies of that as well. If anybody wants them, you can request them. Okay. Woo, time's ticking away. All right. So there's a lot of things you can do to create unfriendly habitats for ticks and their hosts. And those kind of fall under two broad themes. The first focuses on discouraging hosts from not coming around and limiting their hiding places. Examples here kind of include removing old furniture, mattresses, and trash, keeping wood piles in maintained open and dry areas because, rodents really like to hang out in there and build nests, bringing their little friends with them. Things like creating sealed stone walls is kind of expensive, but if you live in really residential areas in Connecticut or something, having those areas closed out to discourage things from getting in there is a good strategy. Keeping things like garbage and bird feeders and compost away from your house or outbuildings, that can help discourage keeping the mice away. In barns, keeping feed in canisters, like rodent-proof canisters, that's also should be done, even though that's not on my slide. I'll have to add that to that slide. And things like planting deer-resistant plant varieties. If you're big into perennial gardens, you don't want to bring the deer to your yard. Things like removing invasive species like barberry and honeysuckle from your property and woodlots, because those rodents love hiding under those dense invasives, and they also tend to provide these microclimates that ticks do really well in with that high humidity that it kind of maintains under there. And you can also do things like fence your yard and also fence your crop production areas to exclude larger hosts like deer, because remember, deer just kind of move the ticks all around. So that can help as well. So the second theme about creating unfriendly habitats is vegetation and property maintenance to reduce that tick habitat by increasing sun exposure, which tends to reduce that humidity. Because we all know, I said it before, ticks thrive in humid microclimates and hate being hot and dry. So to do this, you really have to first identify where the tick problem areas are on your property. And that comes back to tick surveillance and monitoring for them. So you'll probably have like really brushy areas, or that you are out in your woods or someplace in your farm, and you're going to know that you're always going to pick up ticks there. Those should be your real targeted areas. You can also do your own tick surveillance. It's all we do for surveillance is have a white cloth that you can drag behind you. You can wear white pants and walk through brush, and you can be like, oh, this is really tick infested area. So you definitely want to identify your area. And some examples of habitat maintenance include maintaining your yards and pastures really by mowing quite frequently, because it just reduces, a lot of that, it dries it out. And doing things like providing buffer strips between your forest lawn and backyards, and between forest fence lines, between the forest and fence lines. And you want to maintain that by trimming back tree branches, shrubs, and also by mowing. I know there's been some research studies that have looked at that, and the estimate's been about 10 to 20 feet between the edge, somewhere between there. And you want to do things also like you could have a wood chip or gravel barrier between lawns and wooded areas if you're in a residential area, or around patios and play equipment. Or if you have play equipment, you keep them away from the yard edges. You don't want them next to the forest. You kind of put them in the middle. And of course, removing vegetation around them. Things like removing leaf litter from yards as well. But there's actually a study that looked at that, and they say because a lot of times you remove leaf litter and you blow it to the edge of the yard, but I think some studies have shown that there tends to be a lot of ticks in where all the leaf litter goes, because leaf litter, deep leaf litter, promotes really good conditions for females to lay eggs and for egg hatching and for larval survival, just because it creates so much nice humidity. And if all else fails, there's always the pesticide applications that could be made. And chemical pesticides are still the top strategy for tick prevention and control, especially on yourself and pets, and applied to livestock too, and applied to backyards and pastures. And there's a ton of products out there that come as sprays, dusts, collars, ear tags, dips, feeds, and more. The synthetic chemistries remain the most effective, but biopesticides and natural product-based types also continue to be developed. There's a lot of reduced risk products that are out there on the web, and a lot of them claim that they're effective at repelling and killing ticks, and a lot of these are exempt from EPA registration. And these products have highly variable tick-killing efficacy, and they often need to be reapplied multiple times with limited evidence that they work. And also to the expense of non-target organisms. And this makes recommending a lot of them really, really challenging. So if possible, animals should be treated with EPA approved or FDA approved treatments. So it's really important that you read that label and make sure that it's actually labeled for use against ticks. And on the target animal that it says it can be used on, because there's lots of things that you shouldn't use on other animals, it can use on others. So it's really important that, the fine print gets read. There's also these devices that are available to treat wildlife, like tick tubes and bait boxes, some 4-poster devices for deer. But a lot of these require a lot of maintenance, frequent maintenance, and some need to be run by professionals. And for all of these, treatments really need to be made in consultation with pest control operators or in consultation with your veterinarian, who can tell you how to treat your animals the best. And that's all that I have prepared for tonight. So please check out our tick information, our UVM tick information site about tick prevention and management strategies. And thank you all for coming tonight. And like I mentioned before, I'll send a link to this recording out by Friday, and I'll also send the PDF as well. And if you wouldn't mind, there's a link here on this page. If you wouldn't mind providing some feedback about the talk that you saw tonight, that would be greatly appreciated. I can send a direct link to that as well.